The fate of Amy Robsart is one of the great unsolved deaths in history. She was the first wife of Robert Dudley, the great favourite of the last Tudor Queen, Elizabeth I. The sources, therefore, speak of Amy Dudley or Lady Dudley. I chose her birth name, Amy Robsart, to avoid confusion. On the 8th of September 1560, she was found at the foot of a stone staircase in a building called Cumnor Place or Cumnor Hall in Oxfordshire. Her neck was broken. Rumours spread like wildfire that Robert had arranged for his wife to be killed in order to marry the Queen. She, in turn, was suspected of having ordered Amy Robsart's death out of jealousy. Elizabeth's cunning First Minister, William Cecil, was also rumoured to have played a role. However, 11 months after Amy's death, a 15-member commission of inquiry ruled that it had been an accident. To this day, however, historians and physicians have suggested that Amy may have brought about her own death, consciously or unconsciously. But what is true? Welcome back to Lemmy History. Every admired ruler has names in their story that even their staunchest defenders struggle to justify. Henry VII, for example, imprisoned Edward Plantagenet in the Tower for his entire life. Emperor Frederick II, although celebrated for his education, tolerance, and promotion of science, had his own son Henry disempowered and imprisoned. Richard the Lionheart ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners during the Crusade, including women and children. In the case of Elizabeth I, it is Dudley's two wives that prove she not only had human weaknesses, but lived them out openly. I find these grey areas extremely interesting. Combined with an unsolved death, this created a topic for a video I simply couldn't resist. During the course of my research, however, I cursed myself for this decision. The number of theories is far too great to work through completely. I have therefore limited myself to the most common, and in my opinion, the most plausible assumptions. At the end of the video, I'll share my own opinion. However, it's important to note that none of the theories presented here necessarily get to the heart of the matter. There is always the possibility that it happened completely differently. For writers, Amy's death has always been a goldmine. Walter Scott, for instance, dedicated his 1821 novel Kenilworth to her fate. Most of the imagery surrounding her death is based on that book, with all its poetic liberties, and not on the historical events. This also includes the images I show in this video. There are hardly any alternatives. In fact, there is not a single painting we can definitively identify as Amy Robsart. In the case of this image, made from a medallion, however, there is a corresponding assumption. In 2009, Eric Ives proposed the theory that it depicted Amy at the age of 18, possibly on the occasion of her marriage to Robert in 1550. Her biographer, Chris Skidmore, agreed a year later. Unfortunately, the written tradition is hardly less complicated. I'll get to that in detail in a moment, but it's worth noting that some of the sources were created long after Amy's death and were clearly hostile to Robert Dudley. As a result, they repeatedly distorted the course of events. In Leicester's Commonwealth from 1584, also known as the Secret Memoirs of Robert Dudley, it is Sir Richard Verney who is named as Amy's murderer. In visual depictions, if a dark figure appears at the top of the stairs, it's Verney. If there are two men, the other is Sir Anthony Forster, who was also considered a suspect. Both men were followers of Dudley, but at least the first one, Verney, wasn't even near the house on the day of Amy's death. He didn't live there. He owned a residence in Warwickshire, where he had hosted Amy Robsart a year earlier. Allegedly, Robert's wife wanted to leave that place because she feared being poisoned. However, this accusation also surfaced only after her death. Forster was the tenant of Cumnor Place and had allowed Amy to live there with her 10-person household. The property itself belonged to the son of one of Henry VIII's physicians. We don't know exactly where Forster was when Amy died. However, the later Commission of Inquiry was reportedly composed of men who were extremely hostile to him, and yet he was never charged with anything. The same applies to Verney. To address this problem, I've taken a different methodological approach than usual. I stick to the narrative of the events as seen through Robert Dudley's perspective and do not include any information he could not have known at the time. This ensures that no later and possibly manipulated source colors the depiction of events. I'll refer to those later testimonies and to modern historical research only when discussing the individual theories in detail. There are 4 groups of sources from the time immediately following Amy's death that are important to us. First, there are letters. Robert Dudley sent his cousin, Thomas Blount, to Cumnor to investigate the circumstances surrounding his wife's death. The correspondence between the 2 men on this matter has survived. Elizabeth's ambassador to France, Nicholas Throgmorton, also became involved. He dispatched a man named Jones to the royal court following Amy's death. Jones wrote back with his findings, and Throgmorton in turn penned a letter to William Cecil. A list concerning the Queen's potential marriage to Dudley has also been preserved, and Amy's death is included in it. However, Cecil prepared such lists for all viable marriage candidates. Although he was an opponent of the idea that the Queen might marry her favourite, the mere existence of such a list does not in itself imply deeper involvement. Whether the mention of Amy's death allows for a different interpretation will be explored in the section on Cecil. I include these documents in the second source group, Official Files. This group also includes the report of the Commission of Inquiry. Historian Stephen Gunn rediscovered it in 2008 in the British National Archives. Many older works had claimed the report was lost. Fortunately, that has since changed. Unfortunately, the report is of little help in determining the cause of death. Its contents are compatible with every major theory. Still, the report itself comes to a definitive conclusion. It was an accident. Amy Dudley's death also features in numerous ambassadorial reports, which form the third source group. In particular, Habsburg diplomats wrote extensively on the matter, but here we run into 2 immediate problems. First, the ambassadors represented royal dynasties intent on persuading Elizabeth to marry into their houses. Dudley was an obstacle to this goal. Amy's death and the scandal surrounding it presented a potential opportunity to eliminate that obstacle. In the end, the scandal likely cost him any real chance of marrying the Queen. Second, the Habsburgs were fervently Catholic, and Elizabeth famously was not. Amy's death and the prospect of a marriage between the Queen and her favourite unfolded against the backdrop of 2 pressing questions of the age. Whom would Elizabeth I marry, and which side would prevail in the struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism? The 2 chronicle accounts, forming the 4th group of sources, must be read in this context. Leicester's Commonwealth clearly had a Catholic origin, though the identity of its author remains uncertain. Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spy master, accused Thomas Morgan, who had worked as an agent for Mary, Queen of Scots. Later, suspicion also fell on the Jesuit father Robert Persons. In addition, the authorities arrested a Catholic named Ralph Emerson, who was caught distributing multiple copies of the work. This made him another suspect in the question of authorship. This work was the first to claim something that was later widely accepted as fact: that Amy's hair ornament remained untouched by the fall. If true, this would strongly suggest foul play, since the deceased must then have been placed at the foot of the stairs rather than falling naturally. As mentioned earlier, the portrayal of Verney as the perpetrator also appears here for the first time. It further tells us that Dudley stood before the gates of heaven and was denied entry because the names of his 2 wives were a mark of shame on his forehead, having shed their blood. At the time of writing, however, the Queen's favourite and his second wife, Lettice Knollys, were both still alive. The second chronicle account is now known as Hale's Chronicle. It was written in 1562 and 1563 by a committed Protestant. Despite this, the author was a declared enemy of Dudley, though he never knew him personally. This is particularly important because the former Member of Parliament reports heavily on the rumours circulating at Elizabeth's court. But he only knew them second-hand, through hearsay. His account is riddled with errors, some of which may have been intentional. For instance, he also places Verney in the house. Yet at that time, Verney was occupied with administrative duties in Warwickshire. His likely only offence in the eyes of these chroniclers was being one of Dudley's closest friends. Hale is also the source of another claim often repeated as fact, that the head of the Commission of Inquiry, named Smith, was the very same Smith employed at court and allegedly loyal to Dudley. From this, the chronicler inferred that Dudley had stacked the commission with his own allies. Yet the only evidence for this claim is that the man's name was Smith, a very common name in England to say the least. But enough of the preface. Robert Dudley was at Windsor Castle on the 9th of September 1560 in the presence of the Queen when a servant approached him. He told him that a member of his wife's household, who bore the name Bowes, had to see him. Dudley had him come to him and learned of Amy's death in public. His spontaneous reaction was not tears or disbelief, but the exclamation that it must have been an accident. Dudley knew that there would be allegations against him. It was common knowledge that Amy had been a faithful and devoted wife to him. After their wedding in 1550, at which the then King Edward VI was also present, she always remained at his side. When Dudley was sentenced to death for treason for his family's involvement in Lady Jane Grey's 9-day ascension to the throne and was imprisoned in the Tower, until October 1554, she visited him regularly. She did not leave his side afterwards, although he was pardoned, but drowned in debt. The Crown had confiscated the entire family property. The couple survived thanks to the donations of Amy's parents, John and Elizabeth. However, her father died in 1554 and her mother in 1557. And Amy inherited everything as the only child. It was these resources, coupled with the fact that Dudley was fighting for Philip II on the continent, that ensured that things slowly started to pick up again. Amy had some independence and was in control of most of her inheritance. Nevertheless, she immediately shared her property with her husband. In 1558, therefore, the time in which the couple lived in other people's houses was to end. Robert and Amy were looking for a home together that she wanted to buy. Elizabeth's removal from the throne threw a spanner in the works. She appointed Dudley her master of the horse. This was an excellently remunerated position. At the same time, he was able to live at the royal court. Elizabeth also assigned him a house in Kew. The common new home was thus off the table. Amy lived with various of Dudley's followers. He saw her only twice. Once he visited her, once she was with him for a month in London. Dudley regularly sent his wife small gifts. It remains to be seen whether these are real proofs of love or attempts to soothe one's own guilty conscience. To this day, there are discussions about whether the marriage was a real love marriage. But more importantly, Robert knew something that was hidden from the general public. His wife felt abandoned. She regularly bought expensive clothes, most recently a week before her death. But the 28-year-old practically never had the opportunity to wear them and show herself. Cumnor Place had made this even worse. The The building was a former monastery that had been built under King Edward III. It probably served as a residence for the abbot. In the past, however, it has also been speculated that it was intended as a shelter for plague sufferers to separate them from the healthy monks. The building was magnificent but secluded. Cumnor Place was demolished in 1810, but parts can still be seen. They flowed into the Witham Church. The window next to the pulpit and an archway, for example, were carefully removed from the original building and integrated into the church. Otherwise, the stones of the old building were probably used as material for the new building. This means that the fateful staircase is probably part of the church. A letter from Amy has survived, showing how she presented herself publicly.
Mr. Flowerdew, I understand from Bruce that you reminded him of what you spoke to me about earlier concerning the movement of certain sheep at Syston. Although I forgot to inform my lord about it, I ask you to trust me. I further request that you sell the wool as soon as possible, even if it is for only 6 shillings and 9 pence per stone, or at a price you would accept for yourself. My lord very earnestly asked me before his departure to ensure that the poor man be paid, as though it were a matter of life or death. Therefore, I do not mind taking a small loss in order to fulfill my lord's wish. Please send the money to Gruse's house in London via Bridewell, as my lord has given him instructions for the payment. And so I end, always troubling you, hoping that one day I may have the opportunity to repay your kindness. Until then, I must thank you sincerely and commend you to God's keeping. From Mr. Hart's, the 7th of August, your assured friend for life, Amy Dudley. To my very friend, Mr. Flowerdew the elder, Norfolk, given this. Before his departure, he was greatly troubled with urgent matters, and I was also unsettled by his sudden leaving. Nonetheless, knowing your continued friendship towards my lord and myself, I cannot and will not deny your request. Even in my lord's absence, and even if it were a greater matter, should any good opportunity serve you.
Dudley's thoughts must have been racing. It was clear that he could not have been personally responsible. Windsor was 35 miles, or 56.5 kilometres away from Cumnor as the crow flies, and he was constantly present at court. Nevertheless, he would be accused of having ordered a murder. Anyone who knew about Amy's mental state would suspect that she could have done it herself, and that would also put Dudley to blame. He therefore hastily took up his pen to write to Thomas Blount and send him to Cumnor, who had only recently left Windsor.
Cousin Blount, immediately after your departure from me, both came to me by whom I learned that my wife is dead, reportedly from a fall down a flight of stairs. He offers little other information, and the shock and the suddenness of it all overwhelms me. I cannot find peace until I hear from you how this tragedy truly occurred, especially knowing what malicious gossip the world will spread. I have no way to clear myself of the slander I know the wicked world will voice, except by making the plain truth known. So I pray you, as you have loved me and care for my peace of mind, and since I place my greatest trust in you now, that you use every possible method and resource to uncover the truth. Do not show favor to any person, act with your own effort and diligence, but also through legal means, by calling the coroner and charging him most firmly on my behalf to take great care in selecting not unworthy or careless persons, but the most discreet and substantial men for the jury. These should be men whose judgment and integrity enable them to search thoroughly and properly by all manner of examination to get to the bottom of this matter, and who will deal sincerely and impartially. Let the body be viewed and examined by them, and ensure that all proceedings are done strictly according to law. In the meantime, Cousin Blount, please inform me urgently by the bearer of this letter how the matter truly stands, This misfortune so deeply disturbs me that I cannot rest until I know. The cause and manner of it trouble me greatly in many ways. I will not be at peace until I have certainty. I beg you, by the trust I place in you and the love I've always had for you, do not deceive me or withhold anything. Send me your true opinion of the matter, whether it happened by tragic accident or by foul play. Fail not to keep me continually informed. Farewell, in much haste, from Windsor, the 9th of September, in the evening, your loving friend and kinsman, much distressed, Robert Dudley. I have sent for my brother Appleyard, as he is her brother, along with other friends of hers, so they may be present and witness how everything proceeds.
Blount did not keep him waiting long for an answer, and from this answer we can see many of the circumstances that we still cite as a connection with Amy's death.
To the Right Honourable Lord Robert Dudley. May it please your lordship to understand that I have received your letters by Bryces, and I comprehend their contents. I am aware that both informed you immediately upon my departure that my lady had died. You have also given me strict instructions to employ all possible means and strategies to ascertain the truth of the matter, both through my own efforts and by legal procedures, such as summoning the coroner and instructing him to select a discreet and substantial jury for the examination of the body, ensuring that no corruption occurs and no individuals are favored. Your lordship's compelling reasons for earnestly seeking the truth, along with your earnest command, motivate me to do my utmost in this matter. The current information I can provide is that it is indeed true that my lady is deceased, apparently due to a fall. However, I have not yet learned how or in what manner it occurred. Your lordship shall hear of my actions since I departed from you. The same night I left Windsor, I stayed at Abingdon. Desiring to hear what news was circulating in the country, I called upon my host during supper and inquired about any news, pretending I was travelling to Gloucestershire. He mentioned that a great misfortune had occurred within 3 or 4 miles of the town. He said that Lord Robert Dudley's wife had died, reportedly due to a fall from a pair of stairs. I asked him how it happened, but he did not know. I inquired about his judgment and that of the people. He said some were inclined to speak well, others ill. I asked his own opinion. By my troth, he said, I believe it was a misfortune, because it happened in that honest gentleman's house. His great honesty, he said, greatly diminishes the evil thoughts of the people. I thought that some of her attendants who served her might have something to say about this. No, sir, he said, but little, for it was said that they were all at the fair and none remained with her. I asked how that could happen. He said it was reported that she rose very early that day and commanded all her attendants to go to the fair, insisting that none stay at home. Much is judged from this. Truly, my lord, I first learned of this from Bowes, as I met him coming towards your lordship. He confirmed that she would not allow any of her attendants to stay at home that day, and was very insistent on their departure to the fair. She was reportedly very angry with any of her attendants, who suggested staying home. She also visited Mrs. Orringsels, the widow residing with Anthony Foster, who refused to go to the fair that day, and was very angry with her as well, because she said it was not a suitable day for gentlewomen to go out. But the next day would be better, and then she would go. To this, my lady responded that she could choose to go at her pleasure, but all her attendants should go, and she was very angry. They asked who would keep her company if they all went. She said Mrs. Owen would dine with her. This same account is confirmed by Porto, who dearly loved her. Certainly, my lord. Although I have been here only a short while, I have heard various tales about her that lead me to believe she had a strange mind. When I asked Porto what she thought of this matter, whether it was an accident or foul play, she said, by her faith, she believes it was truly an accident, neither done by men nor by herself. She said that my lady was a good, virtuous gentlewoman who would daily pray on her knees, and several times she heard her pray to God to deliver her from despair. I then said she might have had an evil thought in her mind. No, good Mr. Blount, said Porto. Do not judge so from my words. If you should gather that, I am sorry I said so much. My lord, it is most strange that this misfortune should fall upon you, as it surpasses the judgment of any man to say how it happened. But the tales I hear about her make me think she had a strange mind, as I will tell you upon my coming. Regarding the inquest, you wish to be very carefully selected by the coroner to ascertain the truth. Your lordship need no doubt a proper selection. Before my arrival, the inquest was chosen, and part of them were at the house. If I am able to judge men and their abilities, I believe them, especially some of them to be as wise and capable as any man, being countrymen, that I have ever seen, and well able to answer for their actions before whomever they may be called. I have delivered your message to them, and I have good hope they will conceal no fault, if any exist. For as they are wise, so are they, as I hear, some of them very much enemies to Anthony Forster. God grant them, with their wisdom, impartiality, and then they are well chosen men. I cannot provide more information at this time, but as I learn more, I will inform you. Wishing your lordship to put away sorrow and rejoice, whatever the outcome, in your own innocence, by which, in time, doubt not, malicious reports shall turn upon those who wish or speak ill of you. Thus, I humbly take my leave from Cumnor, the 11th of September. Your lordship's life and servant, T.B. Your lordship has done very well in sending for Mr. Appleyard.
We should begin by clarifying some of the names. Pirto was Amy's maid. Sometimes her name appears as Picto, but I have chosen Pirto because it is the earliest version I found in a source I know had access to the original documents, specifically Bartlett's book. I chose this older variant because, at the time, the original materials were still in the best condition. These letters have been re-examined repeatedly since the Victorian era. Although they were treated with great care, they inevitably suffered some deterioration, which is why the name might appear differently in other publications. Blount learned two important things from the maid, things that would have left Dudley with mixed emotions. First, she was firmly convinced that Amy's death was an accident, echoing Dudley's spontaneous outburst when he first heard the news. However, she also spoke of the deep sadness Amy had experienced. According to Pirto, Amy would kneel in prayer every day, begging God to release her from her suffering. Still, the maid made it clear that she did not believe Amy would have acted to bring about her own death. We may therefore understand that while Amy's despair was real, the maid rejected the darkest conclusions about what had happened. The second figure we must consider is the innkeeper with whom Blount spoke. What he said likely both comforted and alarmed Dudley. On the one hand, it was a relief that he too spoke of the event as an accident. On the other hand, it was troubling that he already knew about it at all. The news was spreading. If Dudley had hoped to keep his wife's death discreet, that possibility had already vanished. The innkeeper remarked that it was a shame such a misfortune had occurred in the house of an honest gentleman. Dudley may have taken this as a reference to himself, or possibly it was meant for Forster. Also present in the house was Mrs. Odingsells, a widow and Anthony Forster's sister-in-law, though for a long time she was mistakenly identified as someone else. To keep things simple, we'll leave that aside. What we do know is that Amy asked Mrs. Odingsells to leave the house and became angry when she refused. This suggests that Amy wanted the house empty. Whether that was actually the case, and if so, why, these are questions that remain as difficult for us to answer as they would have been for Dudley, assuming he had no involvement in the events. However, the house was not entirely empty. Also present was Mrs. Owen, the wife of the owner of Cumnor Place, who had come to dine with Amy. So despite Amy's requests, the house was not left vacant. At least 2 women were present in addition to Amy, Mrs. Odingsells, who had refused to leave, and Mrs. Owen. What stands out is that we do not find any statements from either of these 2 women about Amy's death in the surviving letters, nor does Dudley appear to have asked for them. In the literature, it is suggested that the women had been playing cards when they heard a loud noise, but chose to ignore it. They reportedly learned of Amy's death only when the servants returned. However, due to the previously mentioned issues with the sources, this detail should be treated with caution. The fact that Dudley did not inquire further may have had to do with the deep trust he placed in his cousin Blount. Dudley may have assumed that whatever there was to know, Blount would relay to him fully. Before Dudley could respond, Elizabeth personally intervened in the matter for the first time. She created physical distance between herself and her favourite by sending him to his house in Kew. The Queen made it clear that she believed either Dudley, or possibly even she herself, might be blamed for Amy's death. Dudley therefore emphasised in his next letter to Blount that he wanted a thorough investigation, one that would not be swayed in his favour.
Cousin Blount, until I hear from you again how the matter falleth out, in very troth I cannot be in quiet, and yet you do well satisfy me with the discreet jury you say are chosen already, unto whom I pray you say from me that I require them as ever I shall think good of them, that they will, according to their duties, earnestly, carefully, and truly deal in this matter, to find it as they shall see it fall out. And if it fall out a chance or misfortune, then, so to say, and if it appear a villainy, as God forbid so mischievous or wicked body should live, then to find it so. And God willing, I shall never fear the due prosecution, accordingly what person soever it may appear any way to touch, as well for the just punishment of the act, as for my own true justification. For as I would be sorry in my heart any such evil should be committed, so shall it well appear to the world my innocency by my dealing in the matter, if it shall so fall out. And therefore, cousin Blount, I seek chiefly truth in this case, which I pray you still to have regard unto, without any favour to be showed either one way or other. When you have done my message to them, I require you not to stay to search thoroughly yourself, always that I may be satisfied, and that with such convenient speed as you may. Thus fare you well in haste at Kew this 12th of September. Yours assured, Robert Dudley.
It is noteworthy that the Queen's favourite now distanced himself from the initial stance that the incident must have been an accident. Instead, he stressed the importance of proving his innocence. This shift suggests that rumours of foul play were already circulating, and that they needed to be taken seriously. Blount wrote back that he had delivered the message to the jury and assured Dudley that he had nothing to fear. In fact, he believed that those leading the investigation were almost disappointed that they had found no evidence pointing to a crime. Blount himself could think of only one reason why Amy might have been murdered: because she was Dudley's wife. He also informed Dudley that he would return the next day. Dudley did not wait for Blount's return before writing again. He reported that he had been contacted by a man named Smith, who was apparently the head of the jury. Smith had also confirmed that Amy's death had been an accident. This brought Dudley considerable relief. It is unclear whether he had read Blount's letter at the time, or whether he chose to write a second letter regardless. At the end of this letter, Dudley expressed his relief that the jury consisted entirely of strangers to him. He had no intention of further engaging with them, but would leave them to complete their work. Dudley and the Queen were now visibly working to take control of the narrative. On September 17th, preacher Thomas Lever, closely associated with Dudley, wrote to William Cecil and Francis Knollys. He called for a thorough investigation into Amy's death and believed the results would calm and comfort Elizabeth's subjects. At that time, he warned, there was a dangerous rumor and suspicion spreading. Elizabeth herself addressed the matter directly with Ambassador Throgmorton's emissary, Jones. She stated that an investigation had been conducted and its result contradicted what had been publicly reported. Dudley and his men, she said, had been present at court on the day in question. None of this, she insisted, should tarnish his honesty or honor. There is also a direct quote from Elizabeth regarding the events.
My ambassador knoweth somewhat of my mind on these matters.
It is hard to interpret these words as anything other than an invitation to drop the subject. In the end, Dudley was allowed to return to court. Still, the entire episode confirms that the news had by then reached the European continent as well. For Dudley, one final duty remained. He had to ensure that his wife received a proper burial. He spent £2,000 on the funeral. In today's currency, that would amount to over £1 million. As was customary for men of his rank, Dudley did not attend the funeral in person. The chief mourner was Marjorie Norreys, an interesting choice, as she was both the cousin of Forster's wife and a friend of the Queen. The funeral procession, which concluded at the University Church of St. Mary's, was solemn and elaborate. It featured 80 poor men and women dressed in mourning garments, led by 2 masters of ceremonies carrying black staffs. The procession also included a choir, clergymen, heralds, and the deceased's relatives clad in black robes. The coffin was borne by 8 strong men, who were assisted by 4 helpers and standard bearers. They were followed by noblewomen and other ladies walking in pairs, then members of the Oxford City Council, and finally, the common people. The funeral sermon at the church was delivered by Francis Babington, then Vice-Chancellor of the University. He was known to be one of Dudley's close confidants, yet he sparked a notable scandal. During his sermon, he stated that Amy had been pitifully slain. He later claimed that he had tripped. Despite this, Babington eventually fell from favour and came under strong suspicion of being a Catholic. His situation deteriorated to the point that he was forced to flee England in 1565. 4 years later, he died in exile. This episode is particularly intriguing because, as is well known, a few decades later, the Babington conspiracy emerged, a Catholic plot in support of Mary, Queen of Scots. The shared surname suggests a possible family connection, although no definitive link could be established. Returning to the funeral, records describe the creation of a vaulted cellar in the church choir, where Amy's coffin, covered in black velvet, was interred following the sacrificial processions. Sadly, the precise location of Amy's grave remains unknown. A memorial plaque inside the church simply states that she is buried somewhere within the building. This leads us to the central question: was it murder? And if so, who was responsible? Thanks to the report from the Investigative Commission, we now know the injuries that Amy sustained. She died of a broken neck. In addition, she suffered 2 head injuries. One was superficial, only 5 millimeters deep. The other, however, was much more serious, 5 centimeters deep. Christine Hartweg refers to an interesting 21st century study in a blog post on this topic, linked in the description. According to the study, head wounds are the most common injuries sustained from falling down stairs. They account for 36% of all such injuries. Particularly dangerous are short staircases with fewer than 10 steps. The staircase at Cumnor Place had 8 steps. In Amy's case, this means that the nature of the injuries and the short length of the stairs do not rule out an accident. On the contrary, they make it seem all the more plausible. However, the injuries also do not rule out the possibility of foul play. Since only one head wound was truly deep, some have speculated that Amy sustained it in a struggle for her life and was then positioned on the stairs with her neck broken. The Spanish ambassador de Quadra wrote to his king as early as March 1560 that Dudley had supposedly claimed he would be in a very different position within a year if he survived. This was widely interpreted to mean that he intended to marry Elizabeth. As a result, Dudley became the prime suspect almost immediately after the incident. De Quadra and the imperial ambassador even spread the story that Dudley had sent poison to his wife. The Queen was named as his accomplice. According to these accounts, Elizabeth entertained foreign suitors as a distraction while secretly planning to marry her favorite once his wife was out of the way. The ambassadors also claimed that Amy herself suspected in the autumn of 1559 that she was being poisoned. She reportedly felt increasingly unwell. After a change of residence and a new diet, however, she recovered somewhat. Despite this, the ambassadors continued to report that Dudley and the Queen were simply waiting for Amy's death so they could finally marry. In this context, de Quadra described Dudley as the king who shall be. Rumours also circulated that Dudley had been considering divorce, since he had no children with Amy. According to gossip, he had fathered a child with Elizabeth. It was said that she visited him day and night in his premises. Dudley's position as master of the horse was viewed as further evidence of their closeness, since it was one of the few courtly roles that allowed him to have physical contact with the Queen. At the time, poems circulated accusing him of wrongdoing. His behavior toward Amy was described as cold. His love for her had long since faded. This interpretation can to some extent be seen in Dudley's letters following Amy's death. Things became truly serious for Dudley in 1567, when John Appleyard, mentioned in the letters, revived the old accusations. Until then, Amy's half-brother had publicly stated that her death was an accident. But this new accusation landed him in Newgate Prison. There, Appleyard was shown the investigation report, after which he withdrew his claims. Even so, he testified that he had been approached earlier by Thomas Howard and Thomas Radcliffe. They had asked him to accuse Dudley and even offered him a reward of £1,000. According to Appleyard, he refused the offer. The two barons appeared to believe that Amy's half-brother felt slighted by Dudley for not supporting him sufficiently. They sought to exploit this grievance to damage Dudley's reputation. Radcliffe, however, suffered no repercussions. Elizabeth paid no heed to the accusations and even appointed him as Lord Chamberlain in 1572. Howard, by contrast, was executed that same year for participating in a conspiracy against the Queen. What stands out most of all is that there is no hard evidence against Dudley, only a tangle of rumours, and these rumours can all be traced back to people who either opposed him or felt disappointed by him. Ironically, the most damning argument against Dudley is also his strongest defense. He wanted to marry Elizabeth. But Amy's death made that impossible. The persistent whispers of murder rendered him an unsuitable match for the Queen. His impassioned letters, with their desperate pleas for the truth, suggest, at least to me, that he was painfully aware of this reality, yet clung to hope that the tide might somehow be turned. This brings us to the Queen herself. Elizabeth wished to marry Dudley, and for that reason, Amy stood in the way of her plans. She had no significant relationship with Dudley's wife, and likely did not wish to. Spouses were generally not welcome at court, and Amy was no exception. There is no indication that Dudley ever sought one for her either. Court gossip claimed that Elizabeth reacted with intense jealousy when it came to Amy. Dudley reportedly had to assure her that nothing had happened between him and his wife during his visits. However, even in this case, there is no surviving evidence to support the claim. At the time, Elizabeth faced a large number of critics, many of whom resented her for her sex. Portraying her as an impulsive, love-struck woman was a tempting line of attack for these opponents, especially since it was common knowledge that she truly did want to marry Dudley. Elizabeth was exceptionally good at monopolizing Dudley's time, a fact that did not escape notice. There was no doubt he enjoyed considerable favor with her, and as Queen, Elizabeth certainly possessed the means to carry out such a plan, if she had wished to. That the incident occurred while Dudley was demonstrably at court might even be interpreted as a strategic move to shield him from suspicion. However, based on everything we know about Elizabeth's character and intellect, she was far too clever to believe such a ploy could succeed. There is no question that Elizabeth came from a family willing to go to ruthless lengths to secure power, yet this cannot be considered evidence of her involvement. In the end, the same conclusion applies to her as to Dudley. Amy stood in the way of her ambitions, but there is no proof whatsoever that Elizabeth had any hand in her death. On the contrary, the suspicious nature of the incident brought about the collapse of her plans. The fact that Dudley and Elizabeth's plans had collapsed due to the suspicious circumstances of Amy's death shifted the spotlight to the man who may have benefited most from the outcome, William Cecil. As previously mentioned, he had compiled a list evaluating all of Elizabeth's potential suitors, outlining the pros and cons of each match. Dudley's entry was scathing. According to Elizabeth's chief minister, there was nothing to be gained from such a union, not wealth, not prestige, not power. Moreover, Cecil believed the scandalous rumors about Elizabeth and Dudley would gain traction among the public. Dudley, he warned, would only enrich himself and those close to him. His financial debts were troubling. There was also concern that he might behave with arrogance or jealousy toward the Queen, and most critically, his reputation was tarnished by the circumstances surrounding his wife's death. These observations make two things abundantly clear. Cecil was firmly opposed to a marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley, and he considered himself a rival of the Queen's favourite. His concern over Dudley's potential jealousy reflected a deeper fear that the Queen's favour might be monopolised. According to the Spanish ambassador, Cecil even confided to him that Dudley had planned to get rid of his wife. Cecil allegedly identified the intended culprit in advance, should anything happen to Amy. Throckmorton, writing from France, urged Cecil to clarify the matter of Elizabeth's possible marriage, noting that bad rumours about Amy's death were spreading there. If Cecil had indeed orchestrated the death in order to brand Dudley as a wife-killer, the plan had certainly succeeded. Like Elizabeth, Cecil possessed the resources to carry out such a plot, and there is no question he believed such a move could ultimately serve the Queen's best interests. But again, there is no evidence to support this theory. It is also doubtful whether Cecil would have dared to authorize such a deadly scheme against his queen's wishes, especially one that risked sullying her reputation. If discovered, such an act could easily have cost him his life. For reasons similar to those that applied to Cecil, foreign powers have also been repeatedly named as possible orchestrators of Amy's death. What they all had in common was this: their ambassadors consistently reported that Elizabeth would never agree to marry any of their princes as long as Robert Dudley remained in the picture. It is even conceivable that there was cooperation between Cecil and a foreign power. One indication of this is that the Spanish ambassador openly claimed that Robert was planning the death of his wife. This would align with a strategy in which the blame was to fall squarely on the Queen's favourite, and the ambassador's letters would serve as tools to back up this narrative. Of course, there are significant counter-arguments here as well. The political consequences of such a conspiracy, had it come to light, would have been catastrophic. The best-case scenario might have been that Elizabeth would simply refuse to consider any candidate from the country involved ever again. Moreover, many foreign powers were still unsure how to position themselves toward Elizabeth. The succession question remained unresolved. According to the Succession Act of Henry VIII, Catherine Grey was technically next in line. She was the younger sister of Lady Jane Grey, and she herself expected to be named heir. But Elizabeth never confirmed this. After all, Elizabeth had not forgotten that she too had once been passed over in the line of succession for the sake of a 9-day queen. The alternative was Mary, Queen of Scots. Her claim descended from a Tudor branch that had officially been excluded from the succession, but the same had once applied to Elizabeth herself. Legal technicalities were therefore not seen as real barriers. Since the death of Queen Mary in 1558, France had been actively advocating for Mary Stuart as the rightful Queen of England. If Elizabeth was somehow removed, the path might have been clear for her instead. In this broader context, eliminating Dudley as a potential husband would have served no meaningful purpose. The larger issue, Elizabeth herself, would still have remained. This leads us away from the murder theory and toward a possibility that Blount also raised directly. Could Amy's own condition or decisions have contributed to her death? One of the strongest arguments in this direction is Amy's behavior on the day she died. She sent her servants away and insisted that Mrs. Odingsell, a widow who had been staying with her, also leave. It seems she deliberately arranged to be alone, avoiding the company of anyone who might have interfered with her wishes. However, this theory is not without its problems. The house was not completely deserted, others were still nearby, and if one wanted to ensure a serious injury, a staircase seems like an unusual and unreliable setting. A fall there would be unpredictable, requiring extraordinary misfortune for it to be fatal. Amy's maid strongly rejected the idea that her mistress's actions pointed to anything unusual. There's also the curious fact that Amy had ordered a new dress just a week before. This detail suggests someone who was still thinking about the future. In 1956, Ian Aird offered a medical interpretation. Relying on a Spanish report that Amy may have suffered from a breast illness, he proposed that she had an undiagnosed cancer, possibly one that had spread to the bones, leading to sudden weakness or fainting spells. According to this theory, Amy's condition, rather than external violence, could have led to her fatal fall, perhaps due to a collapse or a misstep at precisely the wrong moment. However, it's important to note that Aird did not have access to the Commission's investigative report, which we now do. That report does not mention injuries consistent with bone damage or other signs that might support Aird's theory. There are no references to abrasions or evidence of a prior collapse. At the same time, Aird's theory doesn't account for Amy's decision to send away everyone in the house? This remains difficult to explain. It is worth noting, though, that if Amy was suffering from a serious illness, it would have served as a natural obstacle to Dudley and Elizabeth's plans. There would have been no need for foul play. They simply would have needed to wait. Ironically, this could also explain why others, like Cecil, might have had reasons to act more urgently. So what remains? To tell the truth, even today, an accident seems the most plausible explanation. Over the years, numerous medical theories have been put forward as well. I've linked a relevant essay in the description, but in the end, all alternative scenarios run into problems, and too much has been distorted by centuries of rumor, politics, and propaganda. There are really only two things that speak against the idea of an accident. First, that it was Amy Robsart, Robert Dudley's wife, of all people, who died under these circumstances. Given the timing and her personal situation, a simple accident feels like too big a coincidence. And second, it remains unsettling that she sent her servants away that day. Our thoughts inevitably wander. Was she expecting someone? Someone she trusted? Someone whose true intentions she may not have realized? But it's also true that the house was not empty, and there may have been entirely mundane reasons for her decision. Perhaps Amy simply wanted a day of peace, undisturbed. She was reportedly distressed that Mrs. Odingsill had not yet departed. In an emotionally difficult state, it is not hard to imagine her misjudging a step on a short staircase. And then, tragedy struck. Unless new, convincing evidence ever comes to light, the exact truth will likely remain out of reach. But from everything we know, a tragic accident, however improbable it may seem, still aligns best with the facts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this enduring mystery. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel.